So a pleasure to be back with you for the final installment of our Commentaries series, the Sadie and Henry Bayer Chumash class at the Jewish Center. And tonight, I would like to study with you the personality and the commentary of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. Okay, so there's always a plus and a minus to teaching someone who is so well known and so well known to everyone in the Zoom room. The plus is that requires very little introduction. The drawback is that you know everything already, right? How many lectures have you heard about Torah and Derech Eretz and the life and legacy of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch? So let me just say that this is not intended in any way to be a comprehensive biography of Rav Hirsch, but really the goal, as we've done over the past 7 weeks, is to create the historical context within which to situate and understand the commentary that really is the crux of this course. So I want to paint in broad brushstrokes an outline of the life of Rav Hirsch so that we can contextualize what it is that his commentary is all about. And then, as we've done in the past, I want to spend time delving into the commentary itself with particular focus and emphasis on his comments to our parsha, so that the commentary really comes to life. Okay. So Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, his middle name was not Raphael. Samson Raphael Hirsch's father's name, right? Samson Hirsch had a father named Raphael. But apparently it was the convention in 19th century German, to make the father's name the middle name. So everyone calls him Samson Raphael Hirsch. His mother didn't call him that. His mother called him, Sam. I don't know what she called him, but Samson. He was born in Hamburg in 1808, and his family was a prominent family. And his grandfather was actually the founder of the local Talmud Torah. Talmud Torah in America means like the after school, like the Hebrew school. In 19th century Germany, Talmud Torah is the Jewish school as opposed to the public school. So ironically, Samson Raphael Hirsch's grandfather is the founder of the Jewish school, and Samson himself attends the public school. Okay, because the idea was that the Talmud Torah was, for a certain socioeconomic class of the community, and that's not where the Hirsches found themselves. So he went to the German school or the Prussian school, as the case may be. Okay, at the age of 20, in 1828, he travels to Mannheim, and he studies there under Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger. Yaakov Ettlinger is basically the greatest rabbi in German-speaking lands at the time. He doesn't receive smicha from Rav Yaakov Ettlinger. Apparently, and I think there's a little bit of unclarity about this, but apparently he receives smicha from Rabbi Isaac Bernays. And the part of unclarity is that Rav Hirsch was not in the habit of giving lots of credit and attribution to his teachers. So, sometimes you'll see a rabbinic author, and every other word out of their mouth is, and I heard such and such from my Rabbi, and here's what he said. You don't get that with Rav Hirsch, or if you get it, it's very, 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 very rarely. So the degree to which he was educated by or influenced by Rabbi Isaac Bernays remains something of an open question. Okay. So 1830, right, and he's not spent a ton of time learning in the upper level yeshivos, just a couple of years. In 1830, he enters the University of Bonn, and he's just there for a year. And he studies the university curriculum for that year, and he never graduates. So it's not Rabbiner Dr. Samson Raphael Hirsch, right? He's not a doctor. He never graduated from university, but he was exposed to the breadth of the 19th century German university education. 1830, Hirsch accepts a position, his first rabbinic post. There's a regional rabbinate. So you're not the rabbi of a shul, you're the rabbi of a community, and there might be one shul in the community, there might be a number of shuls in the community. It's called a landis rabbiner, and he's the landis rabbiner of the Principality of Oldenburg. You can see Oldenburg, I think I put it in the map. It's the top left of your map on the first page of the source sheet. It's just a little south and a little west of Hamburg, almost halfway between Hamburg and Amsterdam. I don't know about you, I never heard of Oldenburg, right? What's Oldenburg? It's not a prominent city. It's not a prominent Jewish city, but it's a job. And this was a theme in the early part of the life of Samson Raphael Hirsch. We're going to come back to this, soon. But where was he qualified to be a rabbi? Right? And in many ways, this is a very different story than we have coming out of Eastern Europe. We've basically been contemporaneous with this time period, and we talked about the Malbim and the Netziv. So they come from great yeshivos, and they have all the training of the Eastern European Talmudists. Rav Hirsch doesn't have this. So Rav Hirsch has a much more limited exposure to the great Jewish canon. He's obviously very capable, but at a young age, he's 22 at this point. So who's hiring him to be their rabbi? So it limited, right? So he takes this post in a very small community. We think there's like 40, 50 families in Oldenburg. And as a result of being in this kind of small town, he actually has a lot of time on his hands, and he begins writing, and he writes a number of the works that he becomes famous for and that put him on the map. One of which is the book that we call 19 Letters. I think I have a title page for you from the 19 Briefe on page 2. He actually published it first under a pseudonym. It doesn't say his name on the title page, right? It just says Ben Uziel, and this is the fictional conversation between a sage and someone who's thinking of leaving the fold. And he publishes Chorev at the same juncture. 1841, he moves to a slightly bigger Jewish community, to the town of Emden, and he's there for a number of years. In 1843, this is just a sidebar, but I think it's interesting. In 1843, Rav Hirsch applied for the position of chief rabbi of the British Empire. So I don't know what kind of English he spoke at this point, but it obviously must have been good enough, right, to be applying for the chief rabbinate of the British Empire. So there were 13 candidates, and he makes it. He becomes a finalist. He's one of the final 4. And the way it worked was there's 135 communities in the British Empire, 135 Jewish communities, and each of them gets a vote. And we have the tallies. So this is always interesting, right? To see, where people fall out. So anyone want to guess how many votes? Let me tell you who the candidates are. And then the end of the story because you never heard of Hirsch being the chief rabbi of England. So you know that it wasn't him. So there's 4 candidates: Nathan Marcus Adler, Hirsch Hirschfeld, Benjamin Hirsch Auerbach, and R. Samson Raphael Hirsch. Okay, 3 out of the 4 have Hirsch in either their first or their last name. So how many votes do you think Samson Raphael Hirsch gets? Anyone want to venture a guess? No bad answer here. No one wants to guess? Okay, so I'll tell you in reverse order.
0.
0. You're close. You're close, George. The fellow named Benjamin Hirsch Auerbach receives 0. Okay. Hirsch Hirschfeld receives 12. Nathan Marcus Adler receives 121 votes, and he goes on 1845 to 1890 as a very long and prestigious career.
Hirsch gets 1
of the British Empire. And Samson Raphael Hirsch, out of 135, 2 votes. Okay, wasn't his calling, wasn't his time. But again, like how many people rejected the Beatles? Okay, in retrospect, makes for a good story. So he stays in Emden, 1841 to 1846, and then he gets a promotion, right? So to speak, he applies for a bigger position, and he becomes the chief rabbi of Moravia. I don't know how many Jews are in Moravia, but it's in Moravia that he really starts to come into direct contact, or more direct contact, with the burgeoning reform movement, which was an outgrowth of the Western Haskalah, the Western Enlightenment. So he was already charged, and you feel it in his earlier writings. But when he becomes the chief rabbi of Moravia, he has to make some concessions because he's the rabbi not just of the Orthodox Jews of Moravia, but all Jews of Moravia. So, the Reform Jews want a choir. So Hirsch says, okay, they'd be an all-male choir, but there could be a choir. You ever see the pictures of Hirsch? I think the one I put on the source sheet isn't such a picture, but he wears canonicals, right? The robe and the tie. And right, so there's no Eastern European ever saw a picture of the Netziv and Volozhin, wearing those robes, but Rav Hirsch allowed it. He preaches in the vernacular, right, which was a stunning innovation, right? Again, what Orthodox rabbi is preaching in German, Rav Hirsch allowed the preaching to take place in German. It's unclear to me whether or not he eliminated Kol Nidre or eliminated at least from the Siddur, from the Machzor, as the case may be. It's a fascinating conversation, maybe for another time. But Kol Nidre, it was thought, put the Jews in a very bad light, because it basically said, how could you trust the Jewish merchant or the Jewish financier? That they don't take their oaths seriously. They just get up and say, "Oh, all our oaths are forfeited. They're meaningless." So it didn't have a good reputation among the Gentiles. So we could kind of skip, or at least not put in the Machzor Kol Nidre, and then anything which had any kind of Kabbalistic tinge to it, Tashlich, Kaparos, slugging the Arava on the Hoshana Rabbah, anything to do with Kabbalah, Rav Hirsch basically said we could skip, we could eliminate concessions to the Haskalah, despite his avowed pronouncements that the reform was a terrible mistake, and his avowed pronouncements to support Orthodoxy. Okay, I'll just share with you a great quote from Simcha Katz, who actually wrote the entry to Rav Hirsch in the Encyclopedia Judaica. He said, in Hirsch's opinion, this was to characterize his stance against the reform. He said, in Hirsch's opinion, the Jews, rather than Judaism, were in need of reform. And I thought that was very elegant, right? So you could reform the people, elevate the people, develop the people, cultivate the people, but don't reform the religion, right? Don't reform Judaism. 1851, Rav Hirsch accepts a position which will be the position that catapults him into much greater recognition, and the position that he remains in for basically the rest of his life. 1851, he becomes the rabbi of Frankfurt am Main, and he stays there until his death in 1888. Frankfurt am Main. So again, I think it's on your map in present day Germany. Frankfurt am Main is like right in the middle of the country. So I remember once I was in Berlin, and I was supposed to drive from Berlin to Frankfurt. This is in the days before Waze. So we had directions of exactly the highway we're supposed to take. And we started driving, and I saw a sign that said Frankfurt, and in brackets, it said Oder, O-D-E-R. I spoke a little German at the time. Oder means other. So I thought, oh, Frankfurt, Oder must be like an alternate route. And it said the kilometers away, it seemed much shorter. I'm like, oh, Frankfurt, Oder, that looks good. So in Germany, there's also a river called Oder.
It's the Oder River.
am Main, which is Frankfurt located on the Main River, and there's Frankfurt an der Oder, which is on the Oder. It's totally the wrong direction. The Oder River is basically the natural boundary between present-day Germany and present-day Poland. There was at one time a not insignificant Jewish community in Frankfurt an der Oder, but it's not where I was headed, and it took me a while to figure that out. So good to know that there's more than one Frankfurt in Germany, and the big one and the important one for our conversation tonight is Frankfurt am Main, where Rav Hirsch was the rabbi for the better part of 37 years. Okay, he accepts the position to be the rabbi of what was called at the time the ERG, the Israelitische Religionsgesellschaft, IRG in English, and he starts a whole movement, right? He opens up primary and secondary schools devoted to the philosophy that he had written and preached about for many years of Torah im Derech Eretz, and that's still the legacy of the Breuer School and all the Torah im Derech Eretz models for education that outlived and outlasted Rav Hirsch, that have gone on long since his death in 1888. He started a journal called Yeshurun, which he published and which he wrote in as the principal. And it was during this time that he wrote his commentary to the Torah. 1876, he decides to secede from the Kehila in Frankfurt, and this was basically in conjunction with the passage of a new law in Prussia, which allowed for secession, and he creates what became known as the Austrittsgemeinde, right? Like the seceded Gemeinde. Someone just put that in the chat. Thank you. The Austrittsgemeinde, and it's a big deal. We could spend a lot of time talking about Kehila politics. My teacher, Elisheva Karabach, teaches a whole course. It's a 15-week course called the Kehila. Right, to introduce students of Jewish history to the notion of what it meant to have a kehillah, and what it means, right, of consequence, to secede from the kehillah. It's a big deal. Again, not for now, but there was a lot of opposition to this move, even among the Orthodox. Right, they didn't want to start making waves, and they didn't want to give up on the hope of reconciling with the Haskalah or bringing back reformers. Right, this was a real break from the Reform community to create his own community. In 1885, he goes even further and he founds the Freie Vereinigung für die Interessen des Orthodox Judentums, which is the National Congregation of Orthodox Jewish Interests, which is kind of like an organizational forerunner to the Aguda. Aguda is like the Association of Jewish Schools and Institutions, as the case may be. So the idea was, we need to plant the seeds and we need to draw a line in the sand and say, this is what traditional Orthodox Judaism stands for, as opposed to whatever the reformers are doing, which we consider to be beyond the pale. Okay, and again, Rav Hirsch didn't consider everything to be beyond the pale. Things which he considered to be at the margins or not essential, right, he was willing to make concessions about. But at a certain point, he was willing to say, ad kan, this is as far as I'm willing to go and no further. And we need to stake out our claims to what we consider to be essential and inviolable. So let me just pause here for a second to ask if there are any questions or comments about anything I've said so far about sort of the life and times of Rav Hirsch. Okay, so before we get to his commentary, let me just say really just a word about Rav Hirsch's philosophy. And I think this is sort of indispensable and sort of fundamental to understanding who Rav Hirsch was, what he stood for, and on what foundation his commentary was fundamentally built. Okay, so I'm just going to take us off on a kind of philosophical tangent for a moment. So open parentheses, and we'll close parentheses in a minute. Okay, so let me quote for you. Something that Rav Hirsch wrote in his 19 letters much earlier in life. This comes from the 18th letter. and by the way, not that he needs a plug, but we should all be expert in Rav Hirsch's writings, right? This is basically the philosophy that's the forerunner to modern Orthodoxy and the philosophy to the kind of Judaism that we all stand for and practice today. Most of it is widely available in translation online. Just Google, Hirsch 19 letters. You can get the whole thing on your phone. The 18th letter, he writes the following. He says, "There's one way to salvation. Where the sin was committed, the atonement must begin. And this one way is to forget the inherited prejudices and opinions concerning Judaism." This is source one. To go back to the sources of Judaism, to Bible, Talmud, and Midrash, to read, study, and comprehend them in order to live them, to draw from them the teachings of Judaism concerning God, the world, mankind, and Israel according to history and precept, to know Judaism out of itself. Okay, just flag those words for a moment. To learn from its own utterances, its science of life. With the Bible, the beginning should be made, its language should first be comprehended, and then out of the spirit of the speech, the spirit of the speaker should be inferred. The Bible should not be studied as an interesting object of philological or antiquarian research, not as basis for theories of taste or for amusement. It should be studied as the foundation of a new science. With Davidic sentiment, nature should be contemplated with the ear of an Isaiah history. True, then will arise the question, if something skipped here, I apologize. Pick it up from the top of the next column. What does it mean that I am a Jew? What is Judaism? Nor will the answer to this question be sought at the cathedrals, in the writings of non-Jewish scholars who often see Judaism through a distorting glass and who sometimes think it necessary to destroy the teachings of Torah and Judaism in order to establish their own notions. Neither will it be sought in the writings of the time-serving reformers influenced by external motives, right? And this is the key point. Nor in the writings of Jewish scholars who take their standpoint outside of Judaism, but the seekers after knowledge will go back to the ancient fountains of Judaism, Bible, and Talmud, and the one effort will be to obtain the concept of life out of Judaism and to comprehend Judaism as the law of life. And this effort will lead to the transposing of that which holds the theory of truth and life into actual practical truth and life, in accordance with the old adage, now alas nearly forgotten, lilmod, lilamed, lishmor, v'la'asot, to learn and to teach, to keep and to do. Okay, so let me just expand on this with a really beautiful exposition by Dayan Isidore Grunfeld, who wrote the introduction to the Hirsch Chumash. Okay, so you have a Hirsch Chumash at home. It might look like this. It might have blue binding. There was an earlier version with blue binding. So it was translated by a descendant of Rav Hirsch named Levine. But the introduction was written by this, very astute scholar in the 20th century, Dayan Isidore Grunfeld, who grew up in Germany but ended up living in Palestine and then in England. He writes the following. He says, the endeavor, source 2, the endeavor to explain the biblical text, aus sich selber, out of itself. That's the key line. And on the basis of our own tradition is in keeping with Hirsch's general principle of Jewish research, which he explained at length in the 19 letters. That's a citation I just showed you, especially an additional note to letter 18. What Hirsch wrote there is of fundamental importance of the understanding of his commentary on the Torah. If you want to understand Hirsch, you have to understand this point. Whereas the reformers, when studying Judaism, looked at it as it ought to be from preconceived point of view with the object of modernizing it, they brought all their preconceptions about what's equality and what's modernity. What do these terms mean? Let's read that back into the text. And Hirsch said, it doesn't work that way. Start with the text and then everything radiates out from there. Whereas the reformers, when studying Judaism, looked at it as it ought to be, right? We would put quotes on it if we're writing that in 2020. From their preconceived point of view and with the object of modernizing, Samson Raphael Hirsch, true scientist that he was, objectively investigated the source of Judaism as given phenomena. It is well known that the initiation of modern science was made possible by and indeed consisted in the application of the experimental method, the proper combination of induction and deduction to the phenomena of nature. Instead of construing theories a priori, as the philosophers in the pre-scientific era did, the modern scientist first watches the facts of nature and it is from his observation that he arrives at a theory by way of generalization. Even then, it is always understood that such a theory remains a hypothesis and a single contradicting fact of nature can invalidate it. So Hirsch applies, right, this modern method, which he says, Diane Grunfeld ironically says, the reformers who were supposed to be so progressive and modern, forward thinking, they missed this piece, because to really look at the text scientifically is to look at the text first without first piling on external notions that come from, well, who knows where, right? Who decided that, I'm just making this up, who decided that equality is the highest value? Maybe it's a value, but maybe there's a higher value, right? So, and 100 other examples that would place Torah values in the mind of Rav Hirsch squarely at odds with what the reform agenda looked like. So and I said that quickly, but any questions or comments on that, what I would say very foundational and fundamental philosophical point in the outlook of Rav Hirsch. Okay, so let me just say a couple other words of introduction about Rav Hirsch's commentary, and then I want to learn some Rav Hirsch together with you. Okay, so first of all, you should know that it was received with great fanfare, and almost immediately became a bestseller. Mordechai Breuer, and he's a little biased because he's Rav Hirsch's grandson, once wrote the following in source number 3. He said, one may say that without any concern of exaggeration, Rav Hirsch's commentary on the Torah was in its time and in its era akin to Rashi's commentary for the Jews of Germany. Men, women, and youths who wanted to study the weekly Torah portion would skip all of the classic Torah commentaries, including Rashi's commentary, in order to study Rav Hirsch's commentary, okay, which is really stunning, and tells you that Rav Hirsch basically succeeded in making his book and making his commentary attractive and accessible to a very wide audience. I want to say something more about that. Sometimes we think of Rav Hirsch. I meant to close parentheses. I forgot to say the words close parentheses, but we finished the philosophical point. Sometimes we think of Rav Hirsch as an exclusively Western European rabbi. That's what they did in the West. We weren't learning Rav Hirsch's commentary in Volozhin. I don't know if they were or they weren't. But I just wanted to share with you as what I think is the representative comment of Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Spector. Okay, Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Spector's name is known to us. Why is it known to us? For many reasons, but one of which is because Yeshiva University's rabbinical school is called the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary. It's named for Rabbi Isaac Elchanan, Yitzchak Elchanan Spector. Yitzchak Elchanan Spector, you could see in source number 4, was, arguably the greatest halachist and Talmudist of his generation. What did he have to do with Yeshiva University? Right? He's living in Kovna, right, in Eastern Europe. So what does he have to do with YU? Why did they name the school after him? They named the school after him because when was Yeshiva University's Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary founded? 1896. And who died in 1896? Rabbi Isaac Elchanan, Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector. So in his chus, because he was the Gadol Hador, they named the school after the Gadol Hador who had just passed away. Lahavdil, it would be like if you're starting a school, next year, so you might name it the Jonathan Sacks, Jewish Academy. Jonathan Sacks was never in your school, but as a kavod to the person whose name was on the lips of every Jew in your generation, you name the school after. Okay, so back to Yitzchak Elchanan Spector, Eastern European Gadol. So he wrote an approbation. It's actually just before he died. Just before he died, at the very end of 1895, he died in March of 1896. And if you have time, you could read it. It's actually relatively easy to read. You could maybe just enlarge it, and that'll make it even easier. But he writes this beautiful and flowery introduction. They had just started a translation of Hirsch's work into Hebrew. And I'm going to come back to that in a second. It's a segue. But Isaac Elchanan Spector says, what a machaya that finally they're translating this work into Hebrew so it'll be accessible to people who don't speak German. Right? How much of the Jewish world speaks German? I don't know, some percentage, but many Jews don't speak German. So now we'll have it in Hebrew so that this amazing, outstanding, supreme, what a work, so that people can have access to this. Okay, so Eastern European Gedolim, including Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector, had a deep appreciation for Hirsch's commentary to the Torah. I use this as a segue to the following point, which is how extraordinary that Rav Hirsch wrote his commentary in German. Where do you find such a thing? Right? Certainly, this is the 8th week of this course. There's no one in the first 7 weeks who one could even conceive hypothetically of any of them writing their commentary in any other language. Like the Sforno's living in Italy. Can you imagine the Sforno writing in Italian? Right? Can you imagine Rashi writing in French? It's unheard of. There's a few exceptions to this general rule, right? But by and large, the rabbinic language is Hebrew. Okay, the Rambam wrote the Mar Nevuchim in Judeo-Arabic, and Ramchal, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto wrote poetry and plays in Italian. There's exceptions to this rule, but your magnum opus, right, to write it in the vernacular, wow. So that should tell us right away the degree to which Rav Hirsch had one eye, both eyes, everything focused on gaining access to the current generation because he viewed the current generation as standing at a precipice. The Netziv was writing in the same generation. He was facing the same challenges. We saw his polemicism, right, in the Malbim, same thing in Eastern Europe against their Eastern European version of the Haskalah. The Netziv, you try opening a Netziv. That's a tough read, as I mentioned last week. Right, his expectation was this is a shir he's giving to the students in the Volozhin yeshiva. So they know Rashi, and they know the Ramban, and they know the Gemaras, and they know the Medrash. And once you know all of that, so along comes the Netziv and says, let me tell you a synthesis and an analysis and an explanation and a chiddush. Okay, but what if I don't know all of that stuff? I'm just a regular Jew living in 19th century Prussia. So anything available to me? And Hirsch says, yeah, this is available to you. Right? No prior knowledge necessary. I'm exaggerating a little. Right? He does, have some expectation of the reader, but it's in German. It's in a readable language. It's in the vernacular. I don't need to know Rashi and the Ramban and the Ibn Ezra and every commentator that came before, right? And that's what Mordechai Breuer said. That's how it functioned. People skipped Rashi and the Ramban and they jumped straight from the Torah to the 19th century commentary in the vernacular of Rav Hirsch. So let me just share with you, and this will be the last thing I say before we jump to the text itself. Let me share with you an excerpt from Rav Hirsch's preface to his commentary. He writes the following at source number 5. He says, I seek to explain the biblical verses on their own, to draw this explanation from the literal expression through all of its facets. Literal explanation is code for pshat. So pull the explanation of the words from the treasury of the language of the Holy Writ. We saw this in the Malbim and the Netziv. A deep care, concern, and interest in language, the words of the text, drawn to describe by way of linguistic research. You got to know the Hebrew, you got to know the syntax, you got to know the grammar. I'll draw from the traditions of law and lore, the Talmud and the Medrash, which have been transmitted to us from the days of our predecessors together with the biblical text, those truths upon which is based the worldview of Jewish life. That's the goal. I want to bring to light the worldview of Jewish life. So my commentary is a pretext. It's a jumping off point. It's a launching pad for me to introduce to you, the reader, a traditional Jewish worldview that's based in the sources. These, they are the laws of Israel's life forever and ever. Behold, this is the burden of his soul, of the author, and so long as he does not miss the target totally in his commentary, then this author will not have worked for naught. He hopes to make some small contribution to recognizing the full unity of the Spirit which reverberates through the holy writ of God's word. Thereby we may realize that this Spirit is not the inheritance of days of yore now obsolescent. Rather, it lives with us in the present and it is the future hope of all human aspirations. So see what he's up against, right? Those would say antiquated, outdated, we need to be updated, we need to modernize, we need to get up to date. And Rav Hirsch says, this is not outmoded, this is not outdated. Let me tell you how these texts speak in a values equation directly to the contemporary issues with which you, 19th century Prussian Jewry, is struggling. Okay. So I would just say that Rav Hirsch really belongs to this group of commentaries. I would put 5 commentaries in this camp, each of whom are writing in the 19th century with an explicit or implicit polemical agenda against Haskalah or reform. We saw the Malbim, we saw the Netziv, today we're seeing Rav Hirsch, and the 2 others who we're not going to get to this semester are the Ksav VeHaKabbalah, Rav Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg, right, also writing in Eastern Europe, and the Torah Tamima, Rav Baruch Epstein, the brother-in-law of the Netziv, 2 really extraordinary works that are slightly less well known, but I hope that we'll have an opportunity to explore them because they're very, very significant. As far as the vernacular is concerned, the only one on this group of 5 who maybe in some small way resembles Rav Hirsch as far as using the vernacular is Rav Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg, the author of the Ktav HaKabbalah. He writes in Hebrew, but every third word is German or Yiddish, recognizing that he wants to be accessible to the everyday reader who may not be well versed in rabbinics. Okay. There's another piece of introduction which I'm just going to skip, but it's worth reading in source number 6, which speaks to one of the issues that we've talked about in the past of Hirsch's interest and attempt to unify the written and oral traditions and to show that they're of a piece in his ongoing commentary. Okay, I want to make 4 or 5 points about Rav Hirsch's commentary. The first one, just because it's of a piece with a spectrum that we looked at in a number of other instances, and that's the question of how we view the mistakes or the missteps or the problematic episodes in the lives of the matriarchs and patriarchs. And again, we saw different extremes on that spectrum. Rav Hirsch basically has no problem and has no compunction about pointing to the errors or mistakes of the Avos. Okay, and I'll just give you one example in source number 7, and the sources here are just listed. 7 tells you is the pasuk, and then following it without a number is Rav Hirsch's commentary. So in source number 7. This is a pasuk from the very beginning of our parsha. V'Yisrael lahabes Yosef mikol banav ki ben zikunim hulo v'asalo kitonet pasim. So the story of favoritism, the special coat that Yaakov made for Yosef because he was Yosef's ben zikunim. You'll have to figure out what that means another time. So look at Hirsch's commentary. He says, in spite of the aforementioned weakness, there was the making of a quite exceptional man in Joseph. Not Jacob. Israel saw in him the most excellent of his sons, ben zikunim hulo. He saw himself living on in him, saw in him all the spiritual acquisitions he had made. Pasim, from the word pasas, to cease, to end, seems to be the trimming of the edges of a garment, which used to be made in all cloaks to mark the importance of the personality of the wearer. In any case, and here's the key point for us, in any case, it was a distinction which made him appear as one picked out for special calling. That all this was not judicious or wise, that Jacob should not have listened to his tattle, that altogether to show favoritism to one child had only evil effects in the history of our forefathers, as indeed it has in any home, is stressed bitterly enough in the pernicious results which are shown in this story. They are weaknesses which occur only too frequently in people's lives, but are nonetheless weaknesses. What's the justification? How could Yaakov have favored you? There's no justification. It was a mistake. He shouldn't have done it. And Hirsch says the proof's in the pudding. Read the next parak, the next 10 prakim, and you'll see just what the consequences are of playing favorites among your children. Let me come to the key points, which you see over and over again, implicitly and explicitly in the writings of Hirsch and his commentary to the Torah, and that is his opposition to the effects of the Haskalah, the effects of the reform movement. Okay, and this comes back to it's really connected to that fundamental foundational piece which I mentioned from the 19 letters, namely, how do you order your priorities? Is it Hashem, Torah, and mitzvos first, and then let's think about the applications and let's think about the consequences for the modern moment, or is it let's philosophize about modern values and then see how those fit into the Torah? So Rav Hirsch in source number 8 says, you see it in the pasuk, right? You don't need me to argue this, says Rav Hirsch. It says the Torah says you have to prioritize it this week. This is Hashem speaking to Avraham. The goal is for you to transmit this Masorah and to keep the godly path. Lasos tzedakah u'mishpat. V'shamru derech Hashem la'asot tzedakah u'mishpat. And you can look at the commentary itself. In the interest of time, I'll just summarize it. But he says, just notice the order of the pasuk. First is protect the derech Hashem, and then you want to talk about tzedakah and mishpat. What's justice and what's equity and what's righteousness. Beautiful, but first, v'shamru derech Hashem. Okay? And again, foundational to the notion of how we approach modernity and how we approach modern values. What gets superimposed onto what? And he says over and over again, you reformers, you have it backwards. Sometimes it'll work out because the Torah values and modern values will overlap, but sometimes they'll be at odds. And when that happens, so you can't just decide that people should be educated in mathematics and science. So let's just skip Chumash and Halacha and no, there could be a value, right? Of Hirsch placed enormous value on being educated in the sciences and the liberal arts, but not at the cost of knowing Torah. First Torah, then derech. Okay. I'll just show you because it's implicit, but I think this is what Rav Hirsch has in mind, and you'll tell me if you agree with my reading. I didn't make this up. This is, I think, the standard reading of this pasuk. But at the very beginning of Parshas Vayechi, which we'll read in a couple weeks, you'll remember that Yaakov pulls Yosef aside and he says, you have to bury me in the promised land. And you have to swear that you are not going to bury me in Egypt. Right? That's Pasuk, Perek Mem Zayin, Pasuk Chavtes. Vayikruvu Yemei Yisrael Amusis. Yaakov was on his deathbed. Vayikru livno liYosef Vayomer lo. He calls Yosef and he says the following: do me a favor. Place your hand under my thigh, right, which is a biblical euphemism, which says you're going to take an oath. Do for me chesed and emes. Well, Hirsch is going to tell what's the chesed, what's the emes. Alna sikbereni b'mitzrayim. Whatever happened, don't bury me in Egypt. He's going to be dead. Sometimes we reinter people. Why is this such a big deal? Yosef was buried in Egypt. We were able to disinter him and they took his bones. Yaakov, you're buried. Why does it matter so much? You have to swear, take an oath, and you have to get permission. I mean, it's going to be tough. The viceroy has to go and bury his father, not in his homeland. Why? Why is such a big deal? Look what he says. Hirsch, source 9. But the real motive could lie much deeper. Jacob had still lived 17 years with his family in Egypt. Could have noticed what a powerful influence the Ochezba, what it means to be gripped by the land, was beginning to have on his descendants, how they already began to see the Jordan in the Nile and to find their stay in Egypt, no galut. sufficient motive this for him to press with such ceremonious solemnity that they should not bury him in Egypt, but that they should carry him to the land of their old true homeland. Motive enough for him to say to them, you hope and wish to live in Egypt? I do not wish even to be buried there. You hope and wish to live in Egypt? I do not wish to even be buried there. That is also why he did not express this wish as Jacob from the individual personal standpoint, but as Israel, as bearer of the national mission, as a warning of the national future of his children. So I don't think you have to read too much into this to say, what did Rav Hirsch have in mind? What was he thinking when he wrote this? The clarion call of Reform Judaism in the middle of the 19th century in Germany is Berlin is Jerusalem, Germany is Zion, right? And they take out all the references in the davening to the return of the Korbanos and the building of the Beis Hamikdash and the return to Zion. We don't need to go back to Zion. Well, we landed. We're home already. We're right there. So, right, this line of Hirsch says to see Jordan in the Nile. Like, Higanu, we've arrived. We're there. We've not arrived, right? And Rav Hirsch, and it's also an interesting topic for another time, his position toward Zionism, which was, again, he dies in 1888. So, it's only very, very nascent and, it doesn't really take off until a decade later. But the notion that someone could believe that their home in Germany, Rav Hirsch uses this as a pretext. He says this is why Yaakov made Yosef swear, because if you're not in Israel, you're not home, right? Don't confuse the two. It could be very nice. You could be very comfortable. You could have all kinds of allowances and all kinds of dispensations from the higher ups, and you could be the viceroy. You get comfortable, it's very dangerous. And so Rav Hirsch says, always keep your eye on the prize. However comfortable it is, you got to know the promised land is the promised land for a reason. Okay. Really, the last piece I want to share with you is one of the most dominant, one of the most recurring, and one of the most important pieces in the commentary of Rav Hirsch, and that is his relationship to etymology and his understanding of Hebrew language. Really a revolutionary approach to Hebrew language. Rav Hirsch understood basically that Hebrew, that Lashon HaKodesh is the Ur-Spracha. It's I don't even know how to translate that. The Ur language, I think that's what scholars call it, right? There's one language from which all other languages emerge and are produced. And he believes that Lashon HaKodesh is that language. Everything stems from Lashon HaKodesh. If you understand Lashon HaKodesh, you can understand the root, the meaning, the value of virtually everything. Part of what's revolutionary, and most linguists and philologists do not accept this approach, but Rav Hirsch basically believes that we consider the roots of Hebrew to be 3 letters. So, and I'll show you this in action, so you'll be able to appreciate it more deeply. So, if you have the word, gezel, so that has nothing to do with the word gazaz. Right? Gezel means to steal, and gazaz means to shear, and the fact that they share 2 out of 3 letters, coincidental. Rav Hirsch says not coincidental. If they share 2 letters, it's very meaningful, and he says, and I'll explain to you why. So I want to show this to you in action because, again, you could accept it or not accept it, but he extracts so much value from this proposition that it becomes a dominant force in his commentary. So I'll give you a couple examples, and you'll tell me whether or not you're persuaded. So the Torah tells us, this is from Miketz, we're coming up to this next week. So Binyamin has been called on by Yosef, right? He took Shimon captive. He said, I'll only release him if you prove to the brothers, he says to the brothers, I'll only release him if you prove to me what you say is true. You said you have a younger brother at home. Go bring back, produce Binyamin, and I'll see that you're truth tellers. They go back home and they say to Yaakov, this is the story. We got put on the spot. Our hands are tied. We have no choice. We have to produce Binyamin. And Yaakov says, not over my dead body. Bes Binyamin achi Yosef lo shalach Yaakov elachav ki amar pen yikra'enu ason. Maybe something terrible will happen. It would be too much. I already lost Yosef. You can't make me send. I'm not doing it. What's that? Pen yikra'enu ason. They translate here, lest peradventure harm befall him. Okay, 2020 translation. Pen yikra'enu. Maybe something will happen. So what's that word? So Hirsch says, I'll explain it to you. You ready? Here's a lesson in etymology. Pen yikra'enu ason. Kara, kuf reish aleph, related to kuf reish hey, kuf reish ayin, kuf reish ches. Really? What's the connection? A family of apparently very varied conceptions. Never would have put those together based on their meanings, right? Kara is to read or call with an aleph. Kara with a hey, happenstance, happen. Kara with an ayin, like kriya, to rip, to rend, to tear. Kerach means frozen. What do those have anything to do with each other? Patience, I'll explain. Look what he says. A family of apparently very varied conceptions, to call, to meet, to tear, frost, and ice. Nevertheless, they are all modifications of one fundamental idea. You ready? Kara, to call somebody to leave the direction he had in mind, voluntarily to leave it and come likrati, in my direction. Kara with an ayin, to tear, to bring the parts of material out of their natural direction into the opposite one. Whereas kuf reish aleph is merely the summons to leave the direction voluntarily. Kuf reish ayin does it forcibly overcoming the power of cohesion. Every particle is forcibly called out of its direction. We have already learned that the letter ches most indicates the reverse of ayin. Thus, noach, rest, is nun ayin, na, moving, come to rest. If kuf reish ayin brings the particles of material into opposition to the force of cohesion, kuf reish ches, freezing, does the reverse. It brings the particles of material that naturally have the opposite direction to cohesion. Liquid closely together, stop their liquid movement, makes them cohesive, firm. Kuf reish ayin calls the particles away from each other. Kuf reish ches calls them together. Kuf reish hey, to meet. All those influences, happy or the reverse, which call an object or person out of its natural or self-chosen direction and cause it to take another one, are called mikra, happenstance. Okay? Fascinating. Right? I'll give you one more example. Let me just pick the best one. It's 11. Okay, this is really beautiful. You ready? This is from our Parsha. Perek Lamed Zayin, Pasuk Lamed Daled. Vayikra Yaakov Simlosav. Yaakov hears from the brothers that that Yosef's gone missing. They bring the bloody coat. V'yasem sak b'masnav. He covers himself in sackcloth. V'yisabel al beno yamim rabim. And he causes himself to mourn many days. Listen to Rav Hirsch. Vayikra Simlosav only occurs on very rare occasions, as we find it again in Yehoshua at Ai, chapter 7, verse 6, and with the brothers. Otherwise, as a rule, it's kara beged. You don't tear a simla, you tear a beged. Remember Malbim, and it's very close attention to the synonyms. Beged is the garment which presents people in their outward appearance. Okay? Pain, grief, shame are expressed by a rent in the beged. A rent has been made in the outward relations of people. Their honor, their happiness has suffered a rent. Hence, it is also an expression of avelut. Okay, this is the beautiful piece. Aval and its related roots all express a darkness, a lack of clarity. Afel, the darkness of night. Avel, the root avil, a fool. Ulai, perhaps. Okay, after the brackets, next page. The preposition aval always comes to oppose and limit something. It means but, right? Which had been considered true and decided. If now something has happened by which all joy, every bright ray, all cheerfulness, every firm step on earth is opposed by an aval, a but, then avelut. Is there grief, mourning? The grief is expressed by kriya, tearing, the opposite of shalom, the condition of complete, unbroken well-being, literally being whole. Now, simla is preferably the garment worn next to the skin in contact with the naked body. Simlato le'oro. Jacob tore his clothes right to his naked body, and in place of a soft, soothing garment, put on a hair shirt. Something which touches a man uncomfortably at every moment, so that if for a moment he would be happy. constantly reminds him he has no right to be so. Hence also Vayit Abel. He kept to himself in his grief on every occasion, thought, Aval, but Joseph is no longer there. Wow. Right? What a touching, using right syntax, etymology, what a touching way to express what Yaakov was feeling as he was bereft of his favored child. Let me conclude. I'm going to go 2 minutes over with your permission, but let me conclude with two final comments. One final comment. The final comment is speculative, right? I left this for the end because I can't prove it, but I find it fascinating that so many of Rav Hirsch's comments bespeak deep psychological insight. And I don't think it's accidental. I haven't seen anybody, write about it or talk about it. But you're in the 19th century. How far away are you from Josef Breuer in Vienna, right, in the 1870s, thinking and writing and lecturing about what psychology is all about, and what Freud is going to bring to the world in the next generation. So I don't think it's an accident that we find in Rav Hirsch's commentary such acute psychological insight. You could see it here in sources 12 and 13. I'll just show you one example because it's so beautiful. In this same story, the Torah tells us that Yaakov refused to allow himself to be consoled. He refused. This is source 13. He refused lahitnachem. One cannot actually console anybody. One can only offer them reasons for consolation, which they themselves must take to heart to effect a change in their mood. What a profound thing to say. Lahitnachem is in the reflexive, right? The hitpa'el. Not that anybody could comfort you, but you could allow one to comfort themselves. Because comfort and consolation, you're mourning, I'm going to say something to you, you're going to feel better. Impossible. Maybe I could say something to you, which you'll then take and integrate, and maybe that's conceivable, but it has to come from you. It's not going to come from somebody else. Over and again, you could see, I put it here because it's from our parsha in source number 14 about Ruvain and the guilt that he felt, and right how that played in and to his reactions, and how you could see it directly in his formulation in the psukim. I think there's something brewing beneath the surface. It can't be that Hirsch is so sensitive to the psychological underpinnings of the biblical characters. There must be some conversation that he's having with some of his contemporaries, something that he's reading, something that he's hearing that animates some of these comments. Okay, we're just about out of time. There's so much more, but I hope that this class has given us a taste of what Rav Hirsch's commentaries are all about. He did everything he could to muster every argument in favor of traditional Judaism, in favor of placing Hashem, Torah, and mitzvos ahead of other preconceived notions, so that anyone picking up this text, right, everyone's sitting on the fence, 19th century Germany, we're going to go Orthodox, we're going to go Reform, we're going to stay with the tradition, we're going to do something different. A lot of people made a decision which, the grandkids didn't end up too close to the vision of the masculine. And if Hirsch was trying any which way he could to keep them in the fold, and what a testament to the success of his philosophy, to the success of his commentary, that so many years after his death, 1888, it's now 2020, you could pick up Rav Hirsch's commentary and feel like he is speaking directly to our contemporary moments. Please God, we'll have many more opportunities to study his commentaries together. Thank you for joining me tonight and throughout this course. I will stop the recording here, but I'm happy to stay on to entertain any questions and comments.
Rabbi, do you have